Tensions are rising between the third highest-ranking Republican in the House and former President Trump. Last week, Wyoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney told reporters anyone challenging the results of the last election should be disqualified from running for president in 2024. On Monday, Mr. Trump did just that again. He released a statement calling the 2020 race fraudulent, offering no evidence, and characterized President Biden's victory as, quote, the big lie. In response, Congresswoman Cheney said anyone spreading these claims is, quote, poisoning our democratic system. Now some top Republicans are questioning Congresswoman Cheney's future within the party. According to Axios, some GOP leaders are suggesting she could soon be ousted over her public feuds with the former president. For more, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe and Caitlin Huey-Burns. Ed is a CBS News senior White House and political correspondent, and Caitlin is CBSN's Washington reporter. Welcome to you both. Ed, let me start with you. How are GOP leaders reacting to Congresswoman Cheney's comments?
Well, it's been a little difficult to do that on a day like this when both chambers of Congress are out. You don't have as easy access to them. And frankly, a lot of them are probably running around kind of keeping their head down like this, going, I don't want anything to do with this latest feud between the former president and the Wyoming Congresswoman. If you look at some comments made in recent days, however, you get a sense that there are Republicans out there, prominent ones, that say, look, you know, the election's over, it's time to move on. Even Kansas Republican Senator Roger Marshall over the weekend, who was one of the Republican senators that signed on to the plan to block the Electoral College results from being approved by Congress, who says it's time to move on. It's time for the country to heal and to work on other issues. Didn't explicitly say that the president was legitimately elected, didn't apologize for taking up that position, but said it's time to move on. And Tim Scott, the South Carolina senator who gave the GOP response to the president last week, also saying on Face the Nation yesterday, he's the legitimately elected president. It's time for the party to, you know, look ahead and not necessarily look back. But they're not taking nearly as much guff as Cheney is from the former president. And the former president issued another statement this afternoon citing some unexplained polling from Wyoming that shows that she perhaps is slipping there as well. And ultimately, those other Republicans are going to matter. Wyoming Republicans, do they want to send her back to Congress as their representative? And when House Republicans, are they going to reject her as their leader in yet another vote that she survived last month? Or will there be, you know, an attempt to remove her from that number 3 post and install somebody more favorable to the former president?
Well, you know, Caitlin, some Republicans have questioned how Cheney can be responsible for messaging when she's at such odds with the former president and parts of the party. What is the party's main message?
That's right, and that's why her position and leadership is so critical and why she's garnered so much attention. When you talk to Republicans, they are focused on winning back the House and winning back the Senate. Remember, Democrats just have a 5-seat majority in the House, and Republicans are very optimistic about being able to win enough seats in next year's midterms to be able to take over the House. And so that's why you see Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader, you know, in this really difficult spot, because on one hand, they don't want to alienate the base of the Republican Party, which is still very much supportive of Trump, because they need to see high turnout in this midterm election. They often point to last year's election where they gained seats unexpectedly down ballot, and that was, you know, attributable to some of the high turnout that we saw that Republicans say that Trump helped to drive. So that's kind of where they're trying to figure out how to navigate that. On the other hand, they still have to win back voters that they've lost over the past 2 years, particularly women and suburban voters who didn't like Trump's rhetoric. So when you talk to Republicans, what they're focused on in terms of messaging is pushing back against the Biden administration's policies, calling it far left and overreaching, trying to paint Biden with a broad brush of the Democratic Party. And they're also focused on these kind of cultural arguments which appeal to this base of support. And whenever I ask Republicans, you know, how should the former president be involved, they often say that they want to They want the party to talk about Trump's policies. They don't necessarily want to replicate his rhetoric, but they often highlight policies on immigration and the economy that they would like to tout. And they also talk about the ways in which Trump was able to bring new voters into the fold for Republicans, especially working class voters. And so that's kind of how they're trying to navigate this. And you know, having these rifts at the top of leadership certainly doesn't help. And that's why you see some in the party wanting to move on. You see Kevin McCarthy, you know, in this strange spot and not necessarily defending Cheney. A lot to work on there.
Yeah, you know, Ed, as you well know, this is not the first time that Congresswoman Cheney's leadership has been threatened. Is this time different, though? And if so, why?
You know, it's unclear, because there was a thought earlier this year when she faced that first test vote that she might, you know, lose, or at least the margin would be much closer, and she did just fine. What would be different this time, I think, is that belief that has been expressed by Steve Scalise and others that can you continue to have somebody who is so at odds with the leader of the party running, messaging, and sort of working on the general themes of the party? Of course, the flip side argument might be, can you have somebody who isn't rooted in reality running, messaging, and the general themes of a political party that would like to take back power? And I think her argument is you can't, which is why you need to hold on to me. But, you know, again, the test vote, if one comes when they all get back to Washington next week, shows that she's in trouble. Okay, that's one thing. But ultimately, it's can she go home to Wyoming and hold support there and not necessarily face a reputable primary challenge? There are obviously going to be people who run against her. There are already some, and there may be more, who will try to challenge her, take away that seat. And the question will be, how durable is her brand in a state that she's only represented for the last few years and was not somebody who spent too much time of her life in the state beforehand. It could just come down to basic local politics. But part of what we've seen the former president and his associates and his family members do is go around the country agitating, trying to stir up trouble for their opponents, to try to silence them, to try to discredit them. Whether it's Cheney, whether it's Anthony Gonzalez, this congressman from Ohio, who was a star recruit just 2 cycles ago and now is persona non grata to much of the party because he voted to impeach the president. Whether it's the crowd that showed up to boo Mitt Romney over the weekend, or other Republicans that are getting targeted, like Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, who can't seem to do anything right to try to win back the former president's favor, simply because he didn't do what he asked him to do last fall right after the election. So, you know, how much of this intimidating that the former president and his people continue to do, how effective will it be? Will it matter at the ballot box? All of that still remains to be seen. Certainly short term, though, this potential challenge to her leadership post is probably the biggest concern. And, you know, we'll just have to wait until next week at the earliest to see whether they do something about it.
So, Caitlin, given all of that, who is publicly supporting Congresswoman Cheney right now? We heard Ed mention Congressman Gonzalez of Ohio.
That's right, and Senator Susan Collins said in an interview over the weekend that, you know, not one person represents the party, but you haven't seen a lot of people in her conference come out publicly to support her. Now, remember, last time the vote is held behind closed doors, and we saw that she survived that. So when members don't have to be necessarily on record or in public, the way in which they communicate their fear or favor, you know, depends on whether it's public. But what's really interesting here is that a couple of different dynamics to consider. You know, going back to Ed's point, what we see within the base of the party, as much as they want to focus on policy issues, and we should note that Cheney has been, you know, with Republicans on the major policy issues. What's kind of driving and uniting the party in ways that we haven't really seen on other issues is this, you know, effort underway in state legislatures to change voting laws in reaction to the 2020 election. And according to our reporting, and when we talk to people in the states, they say this is, of course, driven by Trump's rhetoric. And so as much as you have Republicans trying to focus on policies, you do have this base united around this election rhetoric, as false as it may be, coming from the president. And it's also important to note that, you know, Donald Trump kind of came to prominence within the Republican Party during the 2016 election, kind of gained traction by running against people like the Cheneys of the world and the Romneys of the world. He kind of really, gained traction by bashing them, the Bushes and kind of these entrenched political figures, and gained a lot of momentum that way. So nothing to lose by going after her. But again, we'll see kind of how a vote shakes out in the coming days or weeks.
Before we wrap, Ed, I do want to ask you about former Vice President Mike Pence. He gave his first speech since leaving office in South Carolina last week. How did that go, and what's the significance of his timing?
Well, it's not only the timing, but also the place. To do it on the 100th day of the Biden presidency in an early primary state where he'd like to perform well if he runs for president in 2024 was no mistake. And if you read his speech, it reads like somebody who is going to run for president, talking about how we need to find somebody who can unify the party, a fresh start, somebody who can take back our country from what the Biden administration's already done in its first 100 days. It's all over for him in terms of running, or it's all beginning for him in terms of running, except for signing the paperwork based on what he was talking about last week. The question for Pence, however, will continue to be, who is your constituency? Who is a Mike Pence voter in a world where Donald Trump might still run, and where if he doesn't run, there are other popular conservative or Republican leaders in the party who are younger, who may even be more Trumpian in their approach. That is a question he's going to continue to face, and obviously he's got time. We know there's plans for a book and whatnot that doesn't come till next year. He's working on a longer timetable, as are many of the others who are considering this. People like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, the former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, a handful of senators and members of Congress. Pence will be among several potential 2024 candidates in Texas this week for a donor event that's being hosted in part by Karl Rove, and he'll be making some other stops across the country at traditional Republican events in New Hampshire and Michigan later this year. Again, all of it signs of a traditional, laying in wait kind of presidential effort being put together.
Right, a very non-traditional sort of atmosphere, especially when you think about the fact that with January 6th and the events of January 6th, still being very fresh in some people's minds, one has to wonder how that may factor in as well.
Right.
So much to look forward to. Ed O'Keefe and Caitlin Huey-Burns, great to see you both. Thank you.
Take care.